Okay, let's unpack this. We are diving deep into the foundations of the modern global food system. And what our stack of sources reveals is, well, it's a story of powerful centralized forces.
Yeah,
Forces that have consistently prioritized profit and scale.
exactly. Over local well-being, public health, environmental sustainability,
Yeah.
you name it.
And what's truly fascinating here, I think, is tracing that drive for centralization. It's been relentless, just
Hmm.
relentlessly consistent over centuries.
Hmm.
Whether you're tracking Spanish imperial policy from, say, 400 years ago or modern corporate merger mania, the logic, it stays the same.
Control the supply chain.
Control the supply chain, minimize cost, maximize global reach.
Yeah.
It's the same playbook. We often treat our current crises like obesity or environmental strain as, recent failures.
Right, like something just went wrong recently.
But the material shows they are the long-term, maybe even predictable, results of this structural prioritization, this way of thinking. Absolutely. So our mission today is to understand that trajectory of food, how it moved from being, I guess, a local necessity to this huge global industrial commodity.
Yeah.
We've got sources covering everything from Spanish silver mines in Bolivia, the globalization of trade way back then,
Right.
to 19th century food safety battles and even, modern discussions about soil microbes. So the big question is, how do these wildly disparate topics connect? How do they fit into one coherent narrative?
Well, the connection, I'd argue, lies in the infrastructure of power. It's always about power.
Okay.
See, the moment you define food as a commodity like a tradable asset rather than just local sustenance, you start building these complex, often fragile systems, political, economic, logistical systems,
Yeah.
and they all tend to detach the eater from the land.
That detachment seems key.
It really is, and it often comes with immense social upheaval, huge environmental costs, and it almost always benefits those who control the pinch points of the supply chain, the bottlenecks.
So if we really want to understand the modern pantry where our food comes from today, we have to start way back at the birth of the global economy itself. Okay, so to truly grasp the modern global supply chain, we need to begin with that foundational economic network, the one created by the post-Columbian exchange.
Right. And the necessary fuel that bound this new world together, that made global trade even possible on that scale.
Yeah.
It wasn't gold, not oil. It was silver.
Silver.
Silver. And this takes us to a pretty stunning place, Potosí, in what is now southern Bolivia.
Right, I've read about this. It's hard to even picture.
It really is. Imagine a mountain situated over 13,000 feet up in the Andes. Barren, cold, treeless.
13,000 feet, wow.
And it was basically geology's closest approximation to pure silver. The scale of the extraction there was just unbelievable. Despite its utterly inhospitable geography, Potosí became the biggest, densest community in the entire Americas by 1642.
That's staggering context. I mean, to think that a geographically almost impossible location was forcibly turned into the continent's major urban center,
Purely for resource extraction.
it just speaks volumes about imperial commitment, doesn't it? And this American silver wasn't just staying in Spain, right?
Okay.
It was flowing everywhere.
Everywhere. It was essentially doubling or tripling the world's existing stock of precious metals, fundamentally changing global commerce.
And this connects to China.
Yes, critically.
Yeah.
That silver was the financial key the Chinese state desperately needed. The Ming Dynasty was facing severe money woes, serious problems with their currency.
Okay.
So in an effort to regain control of its coinage and stabilize its economy, they made a monumental decision. They lifted their long-standing trade ban.
Just to get the silver.
Primarily to acquire necessary silver, yes. That single political decision, you could argue, finalized the global economic network. Suddenly, you have Spanish galleons crossing the Pacific, carrying silk east and silver west,
Wow.
linking the Caribbean, the Americas, Europe, and Asia into a single functional system. For the first time, really.
So the centralization of trade began with resource allocation, silver. But the sources also show how this centralized imperial power drove social change in these really unpredictable, almost bizarre ways.
Oh, absolutely. You have to consider the social reality in the Americas at the time. When Spanish settlers died without legitimate male offspring, well, stability demanded quick succession, right? So their mixed-race children, mestizo and mulatto children, were often pressed into duty as heirs. And sometimes, astonishingly, they were just declared Spaniards outright.
Even against official rules or social norms?
Often against the scorn of religious or social officials, yeah. But it was seen as necessary to maintain order, to keep the system running. It's a powerful illustration that centralized policy dictates far more than just trade routes.
It literally rewrites social identity.
Exactly. It rewrites social and ethnic reality based purely on the state's immediate needs for stability and succession.
That's a chilling connection. That resource extraction requires this whole flexible social contract to support it. Okay, so if silver built the network, let's pivot to sugar. Because sugar demonstrates how centralized production created not just a global commodity, but this massive centuries-long demand, maybe even addiction.
Yeah, sugar and the brutality of slavery are tragically intertwined. And this relationship, it actually predates the Caribbean plantations we usually think of.
Oh, really? Where did it start?
The sources show the Arabs introduced large-scale sugar cultivation in the Mediterranean way back in the 12th century, and they used East African slaves to do it.
Okay.
When European crusaders encountered it, they developed a taste for it, conquered those plantations, and then just kept the slave system going.
And that system was then perfected or maybe horrifically refined and transplanted by the Portuguese, right? When they found Madeira in the 1420s.
Precisely. They found an ideal climate in Madeira, and crucially, it offered immediate proximity to the burgeoning African slave trade. It was the perfect storm, tragically.
When the scale exploded quickly.
Yeah. Incredibly fast. By 1460, Madeira had already become the world's largest sugar producer. And it's important to note the geographical separation here.
What do you mean?
The brutal realities of production, the enslavement, the violence. It was all kept conveniently out of sight of the European consumers who were developing this intense liking for the sweet taste.
Ah, that separation of production misery from consumer comfort.
It's a theme that echoes right up to the modern industrial farm, absolutely.
And the sheer scale of production drove prices down dramatically over time.
Yeah, it moved from being this incredibly expensive luxury item during the Crusades, like a spice reserved for the absolute elite, to an everyday commodity by the end of the 18th century.
And this shift wasn't isolated, it created new markets too, didn't it?
Totally. It fueled demand for new drinks like tea, coffee, and cocoa, all of which really needed sweetening to match European tastes at the time.
So consumers became accustomed to, maybe even addicted to, sugar long before modern processed food was even a concept.
Absolutely. Long before. This historical trajectory shows how these massive industrial shifts literally shape mass palates. And political life, too, simultaneously.
How so, politically?
Well, think about it. If we connect this forward, the British attempts to restrict cheap molasses imports from French colonies.
Yeah.
That led directly to the Sugar and Molasses Acts.
All right, key grievances leading up to the American Revolution.
Exactly. These were critical factors in colonial protests, illustrating how a common consumer good, something people felt entitled to, can become a flashpoint for independence.
And nothing perhaps better illustrates the raw, almost unrestrained power of these global trade systems than the East India Company, the EIC, and their mission to secure tea.
Oh, the EIC. Yeah, they started innocently enough, relatively speaking, bringing small quantities of tea into England as diplomatic gifts for King Charles II, just trying to secure a favor.
But that modest beginning just ballooned, didn't it?
Ballooned into an unprecedented commercial monopoly. The EIC was eventually granted these sweeping sovereign powers, the right to acquire territory, issue its own currency, maintain its own standing army, declare war, dispense justice.
It was basically a state within a state.
It became the very manifestation of British power in the East. It wielded power no other commercial organization in history had ever known. Just immense.
But there was a problem. The Chinese economy was pretty self-sufficient, and they were demanding. They wanted payment for that tea in silver.
Right. Silver, which Britain was desperate to keep within its own coffers. So this created a huge trade imbalance.
Yeah.
And the EIC found a perverse, yet totally rational from their perspective, corporate solution.
State-sanctioned drug running.
On a massive scale. To maintain the supply of tea, this ultimate consumer good everyone in Britain now demanded, without having to deplete their silver stores, the EIC decided to dramatically increase exports of opium to China.
Opium grown in India under their control.
Exactly. By 1830, they had increased opium exports 250-fold, intentionally creating thousands upon thousands of addicts.
Just to pay for tea.
Just to fund Britain's tea supply. It illustrates the depth of the commitment, the lengths corporate and national interests would go to sustain these powerful global supply chains, regardless of the human cost. It's quite staggering.
Okay, so that history establishes the logic, right? The logic of centralized, profit-driven supply chains. Now, moving forward a few centuries, we see the industrial age apply this same ruthless logic of scale to the very core of food production, the farm itself. The Green Revolution.
Yes, the Green Revolution fundamentally changed the relationship between the plant, the soil, and the farmer. And the initial change was actually a chemical one. It started with the Haber-Bosch process.
Invented around 1909.
Invented in 1909, scaled up by 1913. This process allowed scientists to convert atmospheric nitrogen gas, which is mostly inert, unusable by plants, into concentrated chemical fertilizer. Ammonia, basically.
A huge industrial breakthrough.
An astonishing achievement, yeah. Required vast industrial infrastructure. And interestingly, after World War II, many former munitions factories, which specialized in nitrogen chemistry for explosives.
They just switched production lines.
They were literally converted almost overnight to producing this synthetic fertilizer. The capacity was already there.
So the industrial capacity that fueled global conflict was immediately repurposed to fuel high yields. And this synthetic nitrogen became the backbone of the Green Revolution, enabling the spread of those famous high-yield seed varieties.
Precisely. But the fertilizer alone wasn't quite enough. Plant breeders had to chemically and genetically engineer new varieties, specifically dwarf wheats and rices.
Dwarf varieties? Why dwarf?
They were short, stiff-strawed varieties. And that was absolutely crucial because the old, tall varieties of wheat would lodge.
Lodge, meaning they'd fall over.
They would literally topple over under the weight of the heavier grain heads that the copious amounts of fertilizer produced. The plants just couldn't support it. So the genetic change, the dwarfism, prevented the plants from falling, allowing them to actually hold up the massive yield increases that the synthetic nitrogen made possible.
That's a fascinating detail. So it wasn't just adding fertilizer, it was a biological redesign of the plant itself to handle the industrial input. But this efficiency, this massive yield increase, it came with an immense trade-off, didn't it? Creating what the sources call an intensive, extensive landscape.
It's a very descriptive model of modern agriculture, yeah. Intensification means maximizing yields on a given area through massive, non-cyclical external inputs. Fertilizer, pesticides, irrigation focused on just a handful of genetically enhanced supercrops, like corn, soy, wheat.
Okay, so packing more onto the land you have, what's extensification?
Extensification, conversely, means constantly enlarging the geographic boundaries of agriculture, often by systematically removing people from the land.
Through things like enclosure or colonial expropriation?
Exactly, creating what the sources vividly call unpeopled prairies. These vast expanses are then worked by massive machines that rely on huge amounts of external fossil energy.
So modern farming is defined by these two simultaneous movements, cramming as much input onto one piece of land as possible, while also constantly seeking out new, untouched land to conquer and convert.
That's a good summary. It's doing both at once.
Now, if we apply this same efficiency obsession to protein production, meat production, the economic calculations get even starker, don't they? Dictating global meat consumption patterns.
Oh, absolutely. The efficiency figures are really the driving economic force here. We look at the grain-to-weight gain ratio. How much feed does it take to produce a pound of meat?
And the numbers vary wildly.
They do. A steer in a feedlot requires about 7 pounds of grain to gain 1 pound of weight. That's pretty inefficient biologically speaking.
7 to 1, okay.
Pork is much better. It's about 3.5 pounds of grain for 1 pound of gain. But poultry, chicken, is the most efficient, requiring just over 2 pounds of grain per pound of weight gain. And eggs are even better, around a 2 to 1 ratio.
That clear economic calculation must have driven huge land use shifts, particularly in the U.S.
Definitely. As horses were replaced by tractors and cars in the 20th century, massive shares of farmland, previously dedicated solely to growing oats and hay for horses,
suddenly became available for other things.
exactly, freed up to produce cheap concentrate feeds like corn and soybeans.
And this available feed fueled the rise of the CAFOs, the concentrated animal feeding operations.
Correctly. It dramatically accelerated production. U.S. beef production nearly tripled between 1950 and 1976 as these operations became the dominant source of inexpensive beef. But this system of hyper-intensification, it has profound consequences for animal welfare and, frankly, for the safety of the food chain itself.
Yeah, the reality of this drive for inexpensive meat seems incredibly harsh. Severe confinement, institutionalized cruelty.
It is. The sources mention that 90% of male piglets, for instance, are castrated without any pain relief. And the intense, abnormal confinement, it drives many pigs insane. They exhibit this psychological condition known as learned helplessness, just utter despair.
That's horrifying.
And if that isn't disturbing enough, the relentless pressure to keep input costs rock bottom, leads to truly unsettling feed practices.
What kind of practices?
The sources indicate that to accelerate growth and dispose of waste, cattle are currently permitted to be fed livestock wastes, specifically the rendered remains of dead pigs, dead horses, and dead poultry.
They're feeding dead animals to other animals.
Yes, and furthermore, FDA regulations also allow poultry to be fed rendered dead cattle. It's this closed, incestuous, and potentially dangerous feedback loop.
Designed solely for maximum cheap output.
Precisely. Essentially trading environmental and biological risk for a marginally lower price point at the supermarket.
This entire industrial blueprint, then, designed for speed and scale, it doesn't just damage animal welfare. It rapidly depletes the finite planetary resources we ultimately depend on, especially water and phosphorus.
Yeah, the water consumption figures are shocking, particularly somewhere like California.
A state constantly fighting drought.
Exactly. Farming there consumes approximately 80% of all the water used in the state. 80%. And one specific crop, almonds.
Big export crop.
Huge. Almond production alone uses more water than all the people in Los Angeles and San Francisco combined.
Wow, that just highlights the inherent non-sustainability of industrial agriculture in these climatically fragile regions.
It really does. But perhaps the most serious non-cyclical train, the one we can't easily fix, is phosphorus.
Because we can synthesize nitrogen fertilizer using Haber-Bosch.
But we cannot synthesize phosphorus. There's no industrial process for it. It has to be mined.
Okay.
And phosphorus is absolutely essential for these high-yield annual crops that feed the whole intensive, extensive system. Global agriculture relies entirely on mining it non-renewably.
And the supply is limited and concentrated.
Highly concentrated. Here's the geopolitical vulnerability. Global reserves of minable phosphorus are concentrated in just 5 countries. Morocco holds the vast majority.
5 countries control a vital resource for global food production.
Yes, this heavy dependence on non-renewable, geographically concentrated resources. It's been chillingly described as a geostrategic ticking time bomb. It emphasizes the deep vulnerability we've introduced by refusing to close nutrient loops locally, by relying instead on these complex global mining and distribution chains.
So we've established the historical infrastructure of global trade, the industrial mechanics of high-yield farming. Now we have to address the big question. Who controls the levers of this enormous, complex machine?
Right. And that brings us squarely to the rise of corporate consolidation and the overwhelming power of the modern food giants.
When did this really take off?
The critical turning point seems to be the 1970s. That's when the supergiants began what one source called a great takeover binge. They started swallowing up established regional giants.
Like household names.
Yeah, think of Pillsbury buying Green Giant, or the tobacco company R.J. Reynolds seizing Del Monte. It was an era of massive integration and consolidation across the food sector.
And this structure created what economists term a shared monopoly. That sounds technical, but what does it actually mean for, the person pushing the cart in the grocery aisle?
A shared monopoly means that in key food lines, whether you're looking at breakfast cereals, soups, canned goods, frozen foods, 4 or fewer firms control at least half, often much more, of the total sales.
4 companies controlling half the market or more.
Or more. And the immediate measurable cost of this structure is monopoly prices. Because there's very little real competitive pressure to lower costs or even significantly innovate product quality.
So we pay more because of this lack of competition.
It was significantly more. The Federal Trade Commission, the FTC, estimated this concentration structure costs American consumers roughly $20 billion annually in overcharges.
$20 billion every year in overcharges. That's a stunning cost being absorbed by consumers just to maintain this concentrated structure. Do we have a specific example of that, like on a product level?
We do. An FTC study focused specifically on breakfast cereal. It suggested a 15-cent monopoly overcharge on every single dollar's worth of cereal sold, 15% extra, just due to market structure.
Wow.
And the key insight here is that this immense power structure allows corporate interests to dictate not just prices, but the very ingredients, the additives, and even the legal definitions of the food itself. And this has been ongoing for well over a century.
Which takes us back to the early food wars, right?
Okay.
And the chemist Harvey Washington Wiley. He spent the turn of the 20th century fighting against the rampant use of chemical preservatives and additives by the food industries of the time.
Wiley's struggle is crucial because he really tried to use science to fight industry pressure. He led the famous poison squad tests at the USDA.
Where volunteers actually ate food with these additives.
Yes, exactly. They consumed measured amounts of common food additives like borax, formaldehyde, salicylic acid. Based on the findings regarding borax, for example, He urged strong protective action against its presence in everyday food. He argued it should only be allowed in special, extremely limited cases.
What counted as a special case back then?
Well, when pressed on what constituted a special purpose, he clarified that it would only be for uses such as, and this is a quote, supplying an expedition to the North Pole.
So basically only if you were facing starvation in the Arctic.
Pretty much, meaning it was considered far too risky for everyday consumption by the general public.
But even when the science seemed clear, the industry had a sophisticated playbook for getting around inconvenient regulations and negative public perception. We see this with the fight over how to define liquor, right?
Oh yeah, the liquor industry, particularly the rectifiers who made blended spirits, not straight whiskey, they developed an entire line of chemical additives, things like bourbon extract, rye oil, prune juice for color, even bead oil to create fake bubbles.
All to chemically mimic the taste and appearance of aged straight whiskey.
Exactly. And they successfully lobbied the USDA solicitor to redefine all these mixed chemically altered alcohols simply as blends. They argued vigorously against using the scientifically accurate but off-putting word imitation.
So they changed the legal definition to suit marketing?
Precisely.
Yeah.
It demonstrates how corporate power dictates legal definitions, not based on chemical reality or consumer transparency, but purely to improve marketability and maximize sales.
It's a deliberate strategy of substituting language for reality. And that tradition of policy influence and potential conflicts of interest, it continues today, doesn't it? Especially in the context of dietary guidelines.
Absolutely. This is where public trust gets deeply eroded. Our sources highlight a really significant conflict of interest example.
What was that?
The director of Cornell's Nutritional Sciences program was simultaneously serving as a vice president for scientific affairs for Danone, the yogurt giant, while also chairing the USDA Dietary Guidelines Committee, the very committee telling Americans what to eat.
Wow, that seems like a direct conflict.
It led to a lawsuit, actually, over the suppression of information regarding conflicts of interest related to the dairy industry within that committee's report. It just shows how the pursuit of profit can clearly outweigh scientific impartiality when policy is being written, often behind closed doors.
So if the product is chemically designed for profit and the policy is written to protect that profit, the only step left is engineering consumer demand.
Yeah.
Which brings us to the global marketing strategies that literally reshape our earliest memories and desires around food.
And historically, companies have always had to invent ways to, wrest money from doubtful consumers, as one source puts it. Look at 19th century America. Agricultural equipment companies, the early ones like McCormick and Deere, they essentially had to invent the modern armory of marketing tools. Easy credit, installment plans, glossy advertising, sophisticated sales techniques, simply to convince hesitant, often cash-strapped farmers to buy their expensive new machinery.
They had to create the desire, create the need.
They absolutely did. But the modern iteration of this marketing is so much more pervasive and psychologically sophisticated. And it systematically targets the consumers with the fewest defenses, the fewest attachments to tradition, and the greatest susceptibility: young children.
The fast food industry seems to be the master of this.
A global master, yes. They employ incredibly sophisticated psychological warfare. For example, a study in Beijing found that young children recognized the character Ronald McDonald and affectionately called him Uncle McDonald. They described him as funny, gentle, and kind.
Creating this deep emotional attachment to the brand mascot.
A powerful one. A survey in Australia found that half of 9 and 10-year-olds actually thought Ronald McDonald knew what kids should eat.
They trusted the clown over potentially their parents or teachers?
It shows a complete transfer of dietary authority from the parent or educator to the corporate mascot. It's incredibly effective marketing.
So effective and potentially so harmful that the American Academy of Pediatrics stepped in.
Yes, they called for federal regulation of junk food marketing aimed at children.
What was their reasoning?
They argued that these sophisticated, psychologically manipulative advertisements fall squarely into the category of a significant public health risk. They compared their potential harm to that of cigarette and alcohol advertising directed at minors.
That's a strong comparison.
It is. They urged pediatricians to actively lobby for outright bans on these kinds of ads in schools and on children's television programming. It really demonstrates the structural severity of a profit-driven system, aiming to hook consumers and create future long-term customers from the earliest possible age.
Okay, so having mapped this global, industrial, and corporate strategy that really dominates our plate, here's where we pivot to what else is possible. What are the alternatives? If the large-scale industrial system is structurally flawed, or at least has these major downsides, many experts point emphatically towards small-scale and more localized systems.
Yes, and the arguments for smaller scale are highly persuasive, especially when you reevaluate the metric we usually use, productivity.
How so? Isn't bigger always more productive?
Not necessarily per unit of land. Experts confirm that large, heavily mechanized farms are actually not as productive per unit of land as the highly intensive systems are, meaning smaller, more diverse farms often yield more food from the same acreage.
So it depends on how you measure productivity, per acre versus per worker.
Exactly. Industrial ag wins on labor efficiency, needing fewer people.
Yeah.
But if the primary goal is maximizing total food output to feed a growing global population from a finite land base, then the relentless trend toward bigger and bigger farms is actually fundamentally flawed logic.
That's a crucial distinction. Wendell Berry emphasizes this point, right? That if population requires more food, it makes far more sense to return to smaller, family-type farms where human skill and animal labor can effectively substitute for massive, fossil fuel-dependent machines.
Right. Industrial agriculture wins on labor efficiency because it externalizes so many costs, environmental, social. Localized systems often win on land output and ecological integration.
And this idea of returning to local, intensive production, it also emphasizes the necessity of what's been called the recaptured garden. What does that mean?
It refers to the importance of access to small plots of land, community gardens, allotments, even larger small holdings. These spaces offer workers not just food, but a measure of relief and autonomy from the pressures and dynamics of global capital.
A buffer zone, almost.
In a way, yes. The sources suggest there will be, maybe needs to be, a necessary reinvention of peasantries globally, not in the old feudal sense, but communities focused on securing local livelihoods derived directly from the land, functioning somewhat outside of the volatile global corporate dynamics we've discussed.
That localized future would seem to require a different kind of local economy to support the farming itself, specifically an artisanal economy. We tend to associate artisanal with expensive cheese or fancy bread.
Right, and it needs rescuing from that association with high cost or elitism. This isn't primarily about status, it's about structural resilience and local interdependence.
Okay.
A small farm future would inherently involve more local artisanal production, supportive of the agricultural economy. Think of local blacksmiths repairing tools, millers grinding local grain, coopers making barrels, mechanics fixing smaller-scale equipment.
Our own surnames often recall this world, don't they? Smiths, Carters, Weavers, Thatchers.
Exactly. That structure creates diverse local jobs and skills. It's seen as far more renewably compatible with future agrarian societies than our current reliance on massive, distant industrial centers for every single input and service.
But maybe the biggest shift, the most fundamental pivot required for an alternative path, has to be how we treat the land itself, the soil, which is the base layer of our entire ecosystem.
Absolutely critical. Our sources are unequivocal on this. Industrial farming, resting as it does on the destructive power of the plow and those post-war chemical tools, it's ecologically disastrous for soil health.
How does the plow cause damage?
Plowing violently breaks open the soil's natural structure. It exposes soil organic matter to oxidation, causing severe erosion by wind and water, releasing huge amounts of stored carbon into the atmosphere, and it kills beneficial soil life, the necessary bacteria and fungi.
And then we compound that damage with chemicals.
Exactly. When you compound this physical destruction by drenching the land in synthetic chemical fertilizers and pesticides, you effectively destroy the soil's delicate microbial networks entirely. You sterilize it.
And without that life, the soil loses function.
Precisely. Without the carbon meal provided constantly by living plant roots, and without the rich life of the soil food web, the beneficial fungi, the microorganisms, they can't produce the biological glues like glomalin that fix carbon underground and build the tiny soil aggregates.
And aggregates, like little clumps.
Tiny structures, yeah. These aggregates are what hold water, allow air penetration, and make nutrients available to plants. Without them, the soil literally loses its capacity to function. It becomes compacted, lifeless dirt.
So what's the proposed solution from ecologists? How do we farm with nature?
A key solution highlighted is working with natural processes, specifically through approaches like holistic planned grazing.
Planned grazing, how does that work differently?
It involves bunching grazing animals tightly together, mimicking how ancient migratory herds move to avoid predators so they quickly cover a small area. They impact it intensely but briefly with hoof prints, dung, and nitrogen-rich urine before they're moved on rapidly to fresh pasture. This intense short-duration disturbance, followed by a long rest period, allows the land and plants to regenerate fully before the animals return.
So the animals aren't just eating, they are actively working the soil, aerating it, fertilizing it naturally.
Exactly. The hoof action breaks up capped, hard soil surfaces.
Hmm.
The quick, concentrated manure and urine deposition feeds the soil microbes, building organic matter. It provides natural fertilizer without the damaging side effects of tillage or synthetic chemicals.
And the big benefit of this is
The huge benefit of this entire process is what soil scientists call effective rainfall.
effective rainfall, as opposed to just rainfall.
Yeah, effective rainfall means that when it does rain, the water actually percolates deeply into the soil profile. Why? Because the healthy microbial aggregates, those little clumps built by soil life, are intact. They retain moisture like a sponge, storing it, releasing it slowly, nourishing living things over a long period.
And unhealthy soil doesn't do that.
No. In contrast, degraded industrial landscapes often suffer flash floods right after rain because the compacted, lifeless land can't absorb the water. It just runs off, taking topsoil with it. And that runoff is then followed quickly by drought because no water was stored. If you don't have effective rainfall, the total amount of rain that falls doesn't matter nearly as much. Healthy soil makes the most of whatever rain it gets.
Finally, let's touch on the human element of self-reliance, especially in communities facing the systemic inequities and food access challenges imposed by the current dominant structure.
Yes, this is critical. Historically, especially in segregated urban areas in the U.S., Black-owned businesses were absolutely central to economic and social life. They fostered a crucial legacy of self-reliance.
We see examples like the Black Panther Party organizing community breakfast programs.
Exactly, organizing directly to combat hunger and provide for the community when the dominant system failed them. For those facing modern food access inequities, food deserts, lack of quality options, the costs associated with just getting decent food aren't just monetary. They are immense.
You mean the navigation costs?
Precisely. It's the time, the stress, the transportation required to meet basic family needs, often because local stores don't stock healthy or culturally appropriate or quality items. It's effectively a tax.
A tax on poverty and lack of local economy.
It's a structural tax, absolutely. And these communities are often equipped with immense local knowledge, networks, and tools to navigate those disparities. They rely on localized ingenuity and resilience. But they operate, importantly, with little expectation that the large corporate stores or the broader system will ever fundamentally change its profit-driven model to truly serve their needs.
Which just reinforces the need for more localized autonomy over sustenance, doesn't it? Rather than perpetual dependence on systems designed primarily for maximum external profit extraction.
Exactly. It comes back to control and resilience at the community level.
Okay, here's where it gets really interesting, tying it all together. We have covered centuries of centralized power, from the silver of Potosí setting the template for global commodity trading, to the shared monopolies of modern food giants meticulously engineering market share and consumer desire. This enduring economic structure has dictated so much: what we eat, how land is used, what policies get implemented.
And moving us far, far away from a system where local communities had any real control over their own sustenance.
Right, which raises this really important, maybe uncomfortable question. Our entire modern civilization is, in many ways, based on the incredible success of the plow and those post-war chemical tools that achieved astronomical yields. We fed billions.
We did. It was an agricultural revolution.
Yet we now know with increasing certainty that those very tools, that very system, is ecologically disastrous for the soil base that ultimately sustains us all.
We are at a critical juncture, a real paradox, where the most productive methods of the recent past are actively undermining our future ecological viability.
We've also been culturally conditioned, I think, to accept that our food must travel thousands of miles to be efficient or secure, that global is somehow better, cheaper, more reliable.
But the volatility of the global system, whether we're talking about pandemics disrupting supply chains, political conflicts blocking trade routes, or just basic infrastructure collapse, proves the claim is fragile, maybe even false.
So the true value of localism, as we've seen through these sources, isn't just some kind of nostalgic ideal. It's about resilience. It's about engagement.
Yes. We really should not be strangers to the fields that feed us. Food production is just too important, too vital to our health and our planet's future, to be pushed out of sight and out of mind, managed entirely by a few geographically distant corporations operating under a logic we don't control.
So the final provocative thought for you, the listener, building on all this, is this. If global supply chains are inherently volatile and vulnerable, and if large-scale industrial farming actively damages the essential foundation of life, the soil.
Then what share of your nutrition, of your community's food supply, should you demand be produced locally? Produced in a way that allows you personally to truly understand, engage with, and maybe even help shape the values embedded within your own food system. It's about reclaiming that connection and that autonomy.